By some Western counts, as many as 26,000 Chinese soldiers came home in body bags from a war that lasted less than a month. Beijing insisted the real number was far smaller. Nobody outside the Politburo knew for sure. In February of 1979, the largest army on Earth marched into northern Vietnam to teach a smaller neighbor a lesson, and within days, it was the one being schooled. So how did the People's Liberation Army, the force that fought the Americans to a standstill in Korea, bleed this badly against a far smaller neighbor? The legend of Korea was exactly the problem. The way of war that had once humbled the Americans in the frozen valleys of 1950 was, 30 years later, the same way of war that would get these men killed in the hills above Long Son. But in the winter of 1979, it still looked like strength. To understand the body count, you have to start with what Deng Xiaoping actually wanted. On paper, the invasion was punishment. Vietnam had rolled into Cambodia weeks earlier and toppled the Khmer Rouge, a regime Beijing had been propping up. China called its attack a self-defensive counterstrike and framed it as teaching Hanoi a lesson for its arrogance. That was the public story. The private story was colder. Deng had just clawed his way back to the top of Chinese politics, and standing in his way was an army full of aging Maoist commanders who thought the People's Liberation Army was invincible. He wanted proof that it was not. A short, sharp war against a real enemy would show the whole country exactly how rusty the military had become, and it would hand him the excuse he needed to tear the old guard out and rebuild from scratch. In January of 1979, he flew to Washington and quietly confirmed that the Americans would stand aside. Then he lit the fuse. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. The men who would pay for that political calculation were among the least prepared soldiers China could have sent. The reason comes down to geography and fear. China's most dangerous enemy in 1979 was not Vietnam. It was the Soviet Union, sitting on a border thousands of miles long to the north. Beijing was terrified that the moment its armies pushed south, Moscow would punch down from the north. So China kept roughly 1.5 million troops frozen along the Soviet frontier, waiting for an invasion that never came. The force sent into Vietnam was drawn heavily from southern regions and padded out with fresh conscripts, many of them peasants levied at the last minute. And these weren't seasoned professionals. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that came after. Schooling and military training had collapsed during the Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1976. Huge numbers of these soldiers walked into combat with almost nothing. Some got 1 or 2 practice sessions with live ammunition before crossing the border. In one army, commanders decided to teach just 3 men in each company how to read a map. Think about that for a second. Entire units were marching into fortified mountains, where a wrong turn meant an ambush, and almost nobody could read the terrain. Up to this point, the invasion had looked, on paper, like a sure thing. That was about to flip. By the morning of February 17th, the columns were moving, and the doctrine that Deng wanted to expose put itself on full display. Chinese commanders, trained on Mao's principle of concentrating overwhelming numbers to annihilate the enemy, sent wave after wave of infantry straight at dug-in Vietnamese positions. In Korea, that willingness to absorb losses had worked. In the narrow valleys of northern Vietnam, against an enemy who had spent years fortifying every ridge, it turned into a meat grinder, and the failures stacked on top of each other. The People's Liberation Army had almost no modern radios, so frontline units passed orders using signal flags and runners on foot, the way armies fought a century earlier. Roughly a third of their supplies were hauled forward by human backs and pack animals. Artillery was planned from the rear and could not respond fast enough to help the men actually taking fire. If that were the only problem, the army might have absorbed it. But then came the tanks. Chinese armor rolled forward without enough infantry protecting it, and that was a warning sign the commanders ignored. Vietnamese fighters let the tanks pass, then hit them from the sides and from behind. Dozens of Chinese light tanks were knocked out on the roads toward Cao Bang alone. If this is the kind of history that should have been in the textbooks, take a second to subscribe, because this channel keeps digging into the wars that got quietly filed away. While the Chinese columns were grinding forward and dying on those roads, the enemy they had underestimated was doing exactly what it did best. And this is the part that still doesn't make sense to people who only look at the map. Vietnam was smaller, poorer, and outnumbered nearly 2-to-1 at the border. On paper it should have folded, but the men holding those hills had been at war almost continuously for a generation, first against the French, then against the Americans, and they knew exactly how to bleed a larger force in terrain like this. Now, here is where the popular story gets one thing wrong. People often say the Vietnamese beat back the Chinese with captured American weapons. Some of that leftover hardware was certainly around, but the weapons that did the real damage to Chinese armor were Soviet. Wire-guided Saga missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, and recoilless rifles, fired from ridge lines by men who had been living and fighting in these mountains their whole lives. You'd think someone in Beijing would have planned for that. Nobody did. But this wasn't just about who held the border anymore. It was about what China would tell itself, and the world, once the shooting stopped. By early March, the Chinese had taken Lang Son and reduced it to rubble. And on March 16th, they declared their point had been made and pulled out. Beijing called it a victory, and in the narrowest sense, it was. Vietnam had been forced to divert forces, the Soviets had done nothing, and Deng had made his geopolitical point. So how many actually died? The honest answer is that we still argue about it. Vietnamese radio claimed more than 40,000 Chinese killed and wounded. Western analysts landed on a figure as high as 26,000 dead. Beijing, working from its own records, admitted to closer to 8,000 killed and around 15,000 wounded. The gap between those numbers is its own kind of confession. When a government fights a war, it calls a victory, and then locks the real casualty ledger away for decades. The silence tells you how the fighting actually went. Here is the coldest part of the whole story. Deng got exactly what he came for. The moment the shooting stopped, he ordered every unit to write up its failures in detail, and the army launched a brutal self-examination of everything that had gone wrong. Out of that reckoning came the modernization drive that turned the PLA of the 1970s into the very different force China fields today. The disaster on the border became the argument that let him retire the old marshals and put his own people in charge of the army for good. Deng once described the invasion as a valuable experience for the army. He was right. It just happened to be an experience that thousands of his own soldiers didn't survive to learn from.